Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast. I am Rohadi, coming at you from Treaty 7 lands. I'm really excited to share with you this conversation with Tony Snow. I met Tony 2 years ago now, I think. Not that long. Right when I was trying to dig deeper into the conversation of decolonization, I realized I needed to establish some relationships, particularly with the Indigenous community that was in my midst, whose land I was sitting on. And so I went out looking for answers. And in my quest for answers, I managed to stumble upon an old professor of mine from seminary some 15 plus years ago. And he was in town, so I went in and I tried to ask him for answers about decolonizing, specifically decolonizing Christianity. That's no small task, but I wanted to approach decolonization in a way that did justice to the work. I didn't want it to be just a trite saying or something that was cool. I wanted to do the work. And little did I know, merely asking for answers on decolonization, that's not the work. So my prof didn't have the answers. And so his host, who happened to be a pastor, part of the United Church, he's at VST, which is an Anglican seminary, but he's part of the United Church. And I said, well, I have to meet him and maybe he'll have a conversation with me. And Tony was that man. So I went down to meet Tony and I asked him my question. Tell me more about decolonization. And he didn't. Actually, what I got instead was better. It was an invitation. It was an invitation into an emerging new urban community, urban Indigenous church plant taking place in Calgary. And he just invited me. That was it. So I went. And so started a friendship of us trying to figure out what it looks like to reimagine Christianity through a new lens. Particularly for me as a person of color, as a Christian of color, but for Tony as an Indigenous man, what does that look like? This is part of a 3-part series that Cypher Church had during the summer of 2019 called House Conversations, where we invited Tony and others to share. You've already heard from Nicaila Rees. In this episode, it will be Tony Snow. So let's listen into our conversation. We spoke a little bit about you and your stories, but let's kind of work our way backwards. You come from a line of chiefs. Your dad was, and I was just reflecting on this, your dad was chief and also a United Church minister, which is fascinating because they pretty much put up every roadblock for him to become a minister. Mm-hmm. Like it's all, that video in Banff, they basically smuggled him into the U.S. to take theological studies because the seminary here wouldn't take him. Is that...
Yeah, and he had to get upgrading in schooling too. And if he would have stayed in Canada doing that upgrading and gotten any kind of professional designation here, he would have lost his status as an Indian. So he had to go to the States to do it. And then once he became ordained down there, he came up here and did a year of classes at St. Andrews, I think it's called, in Edmonton, and finished off there. And I met a person who was in Edmonton last year for their final conference group came together, and his name always makes me laugh. Anyway, he told me that he was at my dad's ordination in 1963. He was in the class that he finished off with and then went into the ordination. And apparently we had in the Jubilee Auditorium like 50 Stonies that showed up all in headdresses and regalia and that sort of thing. So that was interesting.
For the ordination?
1963. Yeah.
So was... you explain to us why he would have lost status by becoming a professional here.
Okay. Under the Indian Act, if you got a higher level of education, if you went to war, if you became a soldier, all of those, when you came back, all of those sort of designations would say you're no longer a native person, you are a Canadian. And so you would lose your status as an Indian, you would take on the Canadian status. So you have a lot of Métis people who claim status to a reserve, and that was taken away when they came back or when they got their education. And so there was a hindrance around doing that kind of work. Also, I mean, that was for everybody. If you were a lawyer, a white lawyer in Canada, and you tried to launch a lawsuit against the government for a native person, you could get disbarred and put in jail, along with the person who was claiming, trying to get the lawsuit. So there was no sort of remedy for the world that we lived in, and that was in the 1950s. So
when did that shift?
The 1956, I think it was, when under the Canadian Bar Association, when Native people could actually put forward a lawsuit.
When did it shift for status?
That's sort of around the same time, but we don't, like, these are conditions that are in legal textbooks that say we can do certain things. Those don't trickle down to the reserves until the 1960s, 1970s, when we start seeing all this activism and rise of people who are now becoming educated, now becoming credentialed, now being able to speak for themselves. And so for the longest time, we have situations on various reserves where they're being held back. In the 1970s, 1980s, on our reserve, the equivalency of grade 1, 2, 3 was grade 1, 4, 5, 6 was grade 2, 7, 8, 9 was grade 3. And so that's how far back we were. And that was and over generations, we've had to try to catch up. And it's a big challenge for a lot of people.
Now, switch gears a little bit and work ourselves into history. We've touched on some aspects of status. Can you tell us a little bit about the creation narrative for the Stonies?
It's interesting, and for the Stonies is a particular narrative. For other groups, and the Stonies have subsequent migrations that have come into our reserve, so there's different creation stories. And what I tend to look at creation stories as is they're markers of a generation coming into sort of some sort of context. So when we look at the different stories from different nations, because every nation has a creation story, and how is that possible in and amongst like 500 nations that are here? The idea of creation and connection to the Creator is about what is the term? Hereditary lines. And so the stories that we have may or may not have some connection to those historical markers around place, around belief systems, and why places were split. On our reserve, there's different satellite reserves, and those were formed because different groups rebelled. Reserve is basically a big family, and when reserves rebel against each other and they can't get along, they end up going to different areas and just splitting for a time and probably a generation or so, where they're not in close contact with one another. And that is so that they can go and live how they believe and do what they're being called to do, and we do our way. And so that has happened over time. When you look at the historical record, we are closely associated with the Assiniboine groups, and the Assiniboine groups have been all throughout the plains area into the mountains. And some of the creation stories and some of the myths that have occurred in different cultures, like we are Assiniboine, that's different from the Sioux, it's different from the Cree and Blackfoot, which are one group. It's different from the Dene, which are up north. So all of these different groups have different ways of thinking. Yet some of these stories ring true in other areas. One of the interesting one was there was a story, pre-story in Manitoba about a mountain that became, or a buffalo that lay down and became a mountain. And if you go to Banff, you'll see a mountain that's in the shape of a buffalo. And so, was that their story? Was that translated to them? Was that shared with them? Is this becoming part of their mythology through interaction? So there's those types of questions that come up. For the Stoney people, one group in particular that lives in the Rocky Mountain House area, they have always claimed to have been from here, from the mountains, from our area. And so we're related to those people. And after they sort of separated and different generations come around there, so we are connected to that group. And that group has always said that we come from the Banff area. We came out of the waterfall in Banff. We came out of those sacred areas there that flows into Lake Minnewanka, which is in terms, Minnewanka is water, God's water is what it's called. And so this connection to these spaces tell our history. I used to work with oil and gas. We went to a lot of different sites in southern Alberta and in BC. And when we would walk into an area, it would be just a bit of forest. And when you take someone who knows how to see the land, to interpret the land, to interpret different things that are going on there, suddenly you start opening up. It's like reading a book, and they start reading through pages and seeing where this connection comes in. And as you fill in the picture of where this is, suddenly you realize, oh, this is that chapter in this book. And that's where the whole idea of traditional knowledge comes into play, that these bits of information can reveal whole libraries. And so that's why every little bit is important, and it's like pulling on a thread.
I think another unique story is connected now to when the first missionaries came down from the north. Mm-hmm. And the interactions with the Stonies is something that, I didn't use the term lucky, but when the missionaries came, the approach there, were you welcoming of that, or did you value that the missionaries came in? And your approach wasn't, your answer wasn't from the perspective of the missionaries or the West coming in and how much it transformed you. Your response was, I valued how the Stonies responded to these missionaries, because that made all the difference. Tell us about the stories of those first two missionaries, Bird and the white guy. Who is that guy? I don't remember.
Rundle is one of them.
Rundle. Yeah.
I think first, one of the things that was interesting about last year was I wrote a piece for, I helped write a piece for the Observer. I tried to write a piece for the Observer, but they had already picked a writer to do that. And so he called me up and asked me a question, which was exactly, it was about the Huron Carol. And his first question, it's really his only question that he asked me, was, how beloved is this carol to you guys? It's like that the white missionary wrote for these people. And I'm like, we don't care about it. Because it was more about the relationship. This missionary, Jean Brebeuf, wrote the Huron Carol in the 1600s and had done so when he got sick, when the people had nursed him back to health, and he had lived amongst them before this point that he was sick at. He had lived with them for 23 years. He had learned their language. He had learned their cosmology. He had learned their ceremonies. He had learned their ways of customary ways of giving, but it's a way of honoring. And so when he got well, he gave this song, which was something that he wrote in their language to a tune that he knew from his background. It was a folk tune, French folk tune. And this gift to them was not, you have to learn this is your nativity story that you have to know. It was an effort to tell the story in a way they would understand. And a lot of the symbols, a lot of the references in the language, in the original, were around that idea of these are the stars. This star in particular that's important to this tribe has meaning, and it is connected. So he was trying to draw a lot of parallels. And it was an honest effort. It was a good effort to do that type of work. And I think that is more key than people coming in and trying to convert or to subvert cultures and languages and spiritual practices. When we see that effort of, especially with the early explorers, to learn and to be open to engagement and to working with people, because they had to survive. They didn't know the land. They didn't know anything about it. They didn't know the languages. And they had to do what they could to sort of fumble their way through, which is kind of where we are today. And in terms of the church, in terms of our communities, in terms of our governance structures, politics, that we don't know where we are and we don't know what we're doing. But if we work together, we can utilize knowledges of everyone to try to build something that will be more robust than where we're living in. And that is sort of the lesson that I take away from the interaction between those first missionaries. It is unique because the first missionary that really came out and made a difference out here was Henry Bird Steinhauer, who was a Ojibwe missionary in the Methodist Church, who was taken to Boston, given the last name Steinhauer as a part of the agreement that he would take on the name, he would become a missionary, he would learn through the different seminaries there, and then go out to the different communities and start preaching. And so he learned 7 languages. He knew Greek, he knew Latin, he knew Cree, he knew English, he knew the different languages that he spoke here throughout the prairies. And so he made that effort to get to know the Stoney people. When he came out here, he first came to Edmonton, set up shop at Whitefish First Nation, set up a church there, church group, mission, went to Edmonton, came down to where the other missions were now being set up in the Red Deer area, north of Red Deer, and then came this way to the Rocky Mountain area with the Reverend Robert Rundle in the 1840s, 1850s. And with that, working together, was able to make Christianity more palatable to the native people. When he brought the Bible, he said, "Here is a good book. Take from it what you will. Learn from it all that you can, because it can help your people." He didn't tell them what you believe in is from the devil, what you understand about the world is wrong, you have to do it this way, and this is the only way. He never said that. And that was an interesting sort of take, because no one else was doing that. Everyone else is kind of going the other way. The missionaries, and that really sinks in when you start thinking about what happened after these explorers came through, after the mission schools and all this effort. You start having the bureaucratic processes stepping in. So you had here, when the McDougall family was brought down by my ancestors to Morley to set up the church there. Their big mission was to go and to try to work with the Blackfoot groups, because they were the ones killing most of the people, and they were the ones who didn't want anyone incurring on their lands. And so there was a big sort of shift to try to bring them on side and to work together. And as they progressed, they went and signed the treaties, and they brought in the schools, the mission schools from the Catholic and the Anglican churches didn't have missionaries that came through like that, didn't have anybody that first call was to be in relationship. Their first call was to indoctrinate, was to change the people. And so you have, especially in southern Alberta, that real dichotomy between us, who are people who accept Christianity and who kind of understand that we do it our own way, and then other groups that have a huge disdain for it because that was imposed on them, and they never agreed to be part of that belief system. And yet it's torn apart their communities. And so it's been difficult to tell that story evenly, to say that actually, as long as we are understanding in a better relationship, we can actually progress together. That hasn't always happened. And so the people's experience of that is one of leeriness and questioning, and they don't trust the groups that come in to say that we want to work with you, even if they are sort of the best intention. With our group in Morley, there was one time when the missionary, or the reverend was there in the 1980s. The Baptists wanted to come out and paint the church. That was their good works. They wanted to come out and offer their services and do that. And so the missionary there, or the reverend there, who was there for 30 years, chased them out of the building, yelled at them and all this sort of thing, and really didn't want them around. And because that was his church and that was his area. That's not what we believe about the world. And so it takes all kinds. And even though we try to do our best, there are slip-ups.
So this is a picture of Stoney culture and acceptance. But it wasn't long until those arms, that bureaucratic arm of colonization came. It was only
a few
20 years?
Yeah, a few short years. The first mission schools that happened out there, the kids were going to the Reverend McDougall's house in the 1870s, 1880s. In the 1883, John McDougall requested a building because he had too many kids being sent to him by the families. They were sending too many kids to him, then they had to sleep over at his house and to be trained and educated. And so the people wanted that. And turning around, he applied for a mission school and got through that whole process. Once it got set up, and he had a lot of sort of racist writings and things that he thought about Native people, but he never overtly said them. The schooling that came after, and the superintendents that came after, and the teachers that came after, all reinforced exactly what was happening on every other reserve. So what happened, even though we had started at a good place, what happened everywhere happened at Morley. And Morley was split between the residential school that happened there and also the one at Red Deer. There was a Red Deer residential school under the United Church, was in some of the literature, was one of the most brutal residential schools, with sort of the most deaths and the most abuses that went on. And there was a grave site that was there for all the children. So what one of the authors in the States said was, at these residential schools, there were a lot of grave sites. There weren't any playgrounds.
I mean, what is the impact of all that in presently, even though Your dad was a minister as well. I mean, just because you have that short history at the start,
Yep.
the realities today would have perhaps, when you can speak on this, erased that start?
I think to a certain extent it could have. If we didn't have those 40, 50 years of integration with Christianity into our belief system, if we didn't have a way of looking at Christianity with a sense of hope, as this is the interconnection that happens between different cultures, different belief systems, different groups. And so taking that as a marker that there's a possibility of working together and living through that, even though we have a lot of hard times, hardship, and people that are continuously trying to rein in and subvert what we're doing, we still have a sense that this is not the reality we're supposed to be in. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And that comes through every historical translation of anyone who was at the treaty signings across the country. That in these treaty signings, that idea of a better relationship is always at the forefront from our Indigenous elders. Whereas from the government, it was only signed here and it's a land transaction. So these two ideas, polar opposite ideas, always ring true. That idea that we understand the world a certain way, and we are stubborn enough to say, if you're not going to live by those rules, we'll continue to reinforce that in some way, in a very activist way or in a very political way. And so that's natural for all of us that come up through a reserve system. Very different if you're growing up in a city environment with the issues around homelessness, around addiction, around sex trade, and that type of thing, where people are more disenfranchised in the urban setting. It's very difficult to give them a cultural grounding. And I saw this firsthand in areas in Toronto and in Winnipeg, where it is very difficult to reach out to give people a sense of being, a sense of wellness within their communities. It's a struggle. And yet, from our reserve, we have people who were more recently, this past summer, working on a lot of the cultural endeavors. So they would go out and they would tan hides. They would go out and they would be part of the land. They would go out and do different types of things that they would be normally associated to do during the summer in our culture. And a lot of these people, a lot of the youth that went through this, the young people who were drug addicts, who were out of incarceration and that type of background, at the end of it were saying, I never knew that I could go and just do this type of stuff. I never knew that I was free to sort of live my culture. And I never knew that that was what was expected of me. And rather, they thought that they could just, their only purpose on the reserve is to sort of lie around and take drugs. That's not, that's one perspective of one guy saying that's what he thought. And yet, that problem comes up over and over again.
Where are we supposed to go with a legacy of colonization, with its footprint, I think, firmly established
on the neck of
still unto this day, brings us and all of us here in this room into a space of decolonization. So working working against subverting systems of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
But that's daunting.
That's Christianity. That's religion. That's the focus of being in and amongst one another and in community. I think that that is one of the things that we've sort of put aside in favor of ritual and in favor of nice services with good music. That's the meaning behind it that we need to reinforce. That, to me, I've always said this, that religion is it's a way of being in community. It's a way of coming together. And that impetus of religion is always to build community apart from family. Because we have families, we have groupings. Beyond that, with other nations, with other groups, this was Christ's work, that we needed to sort of step outside of that sense of place. So when we come to some place, relating it back to the Cavan Basin, Cavan Basin has a significant area there that is the basin, that is the well, and it is a purifying water. And it is very much in our tradition to sort of, it has a big hole at the top. It kind of makes it look like the Dome of the Rock. And one of the things around this space is the ability for many forms to take on meaning. One of the things that Vine Deloria, American theologian, talks about is how these places, special places, places of worship, places of sacredness, have a space unto themselves. And the work that we do connects us to that in a particular way. People can go through these spaces and never know how significant they are, can never understand what they mean culturally, what they mean historically, what they mean in their lives. And others who are sort of trained with the meaning, the understanding of this space, can bring whole new meanings to their connection to it and also share that. And that's kind of what the Stoney story is about sharing that connection to space, sharing that connection to our way of thinking and our understanding in order to elicit that similar response from the settler, from the immigrant, from others who come into that space, to be able to understand that here's one way of looking at it. Here's one way of looking at the world. It's not the only way. It's a way that works for us. And you may have significant places that are sacred and connected for you and or your people. And it's important that we find those spaces so that we are grounded, we are centered, we know where we come from, we know what we believe, and we can take those teachings, share them in and amongst different groups. We are given a chance to find that space of ecumenicalism, because it's out there. It's out there in the world. It's there to connect to, and it's there for others to connect to. When I think about sacred spaces, I think about the Cypress Hills in southern Alberta. Those particularly were a sacred space for the Stoney Assiniboine people. We had our most prominent ceremonies there. It was a place of power. It was a place of immense understanding with the world. When Sitting Bull came up after the Battle of the Little Bighorn to escape the American, he went there because that was the place, that was the seat of power. And there's a connectedness there. It is significant for us, the Stoney people, but it's also significant for the Blackfoot people. They use that same space. The Crees use it. Others, Gros Ventre from the south, they know of that space and they use that space in their own way. lot of what happened, and Vine Deloria goes into this about other spaces in the U.S. where huge cycles of ceremonies would take place amongst the land, and they would always do this in a way that they would be there for a certain time, and then they would move out, and another group would be able to move in to do their thing. Not in exactly the same space or in exactly the same way. They would do their own ceremony there. And so this idea of shared spaces and spaces that are fluid for our understanding is critical in order to think about how complex we all are and how we are able to live in and amongst each other, not to strictly define one another, to say you're only this and you're only ever going to be that, but to appreciate the livedness of what people are and their experience in culture and the value that comes from that, being able to share that and to teach that in and amongst other groups. And so that's kind of what, for me, what my whole ministry is about.
How is it even possible to be in a posture of receiving after centuries of systemic oppression?
I think the hard part about it is that it's disappearing within our own culture, and it's very difficult to sort of reinforce. That's the breakdown of our communities and the governance structures within our communities, a lot of corruption going on. That is the hindrance of an excess of taking away from others and hoarding, and it is soul destroying to be involved with that type of way of thinking. And so always when that type of sort of mentality came into play, it was always sort of shunted out by elders who would say this is not how we're to live, and they would reinforce what they believed. Or it would be one of those situations where they would go and they would live according to the way they want to live, and then that, whether they live or die by that, that's up to God. The idea of being able to maintain a sense of cultural identity that is connected to spaces on the land, teachings, and elders who know, each one of those elements is falling away, has fallen away. So our ability to go out to our sacred areas, limited, as we were saying. But we've tried to change that with the MOU with the Banff Parks and trying to work with the Stoney people. We're the only nation that has that extent of an agreement with the Banff Parks, with the parks in Canada. And then for the teachings and the ability to remember and have an oral history that's encoded in the language. And so a lot of these places don't have those connections to the language. This year is the UN year of Indigenous languages. And so haven't seen much in terms of people advocating for that or working towards understanding that how you believe and how you see the world comes out in everything that you say. And we are constantly colored by, in this English language, that it is a remnant of that colonial way of expression, way of thinking, way of formulating ideas. And so that is different. And then with our elders, for generations now, for 30, 40 years, we have been losing elders more than we are gaining, and to the point where we have huge youth populations coming up on reserves. And so they're the largest groups of people that are coming up under 20. Majority of the populations on many of these reserves are under 20, 25. And they're not getting a good education. They're not getting a lot of cultural teaching. They're not getting a lot of help and instruction. And so what's the world going to look like in 10 years?
So then what gives you hope?
I think
you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know?
I think that there's a possibility of being able to find a better way of doing things and bringing about different understandings by challenging, being sort of the one that's in the system. I'm going to make as much noise as I can and advocate for others to be brought alongside to do the same. And until we start getting some tangible results. And this is not me just working in the church. It's me working in government areas, in business areas. This is what I've been doing all my life.
Yeah. I mean, and we've had this conversation before, and to bring in Nathan's question here, I'm skeptical that change can happen within, and we'll use just institutional churches as the example, but I'm skeptical that the institutional church in a Canadian context is capable of the level of change that we are, any change that we speak of, yet you remain hopeful.
That doesn't mean we don't do it. And that doesn't mean it's not a slow roll. It means that the next generation has to pick this up and they have to be taught. They have to learn to push that just a little farther.
So then why within the framework of the institution? Why not something new?
I think this is the framework that I'm most familiar with and what I've been doing. So
You are planting
yeah,
something relatively new
yeah,
in an Indigenous and specifically urban and Indigenous-led
yeah.
plant. Can it continue outside of, I don't really see, other than yourself, the hands of the United Church on it? Could it go on outside of it?
I think it should. I think that the work that I'm trying to do is ecumenical and interdenominational, intertribal. So it is beyond the one group, because I don't think that, and I think that this happens a lot, where within a particular group or institution that a formulaic way becomes subsumed under whatever they're doing. Whereas, and I like what you're doing with a number of the ideas around people of color coming together out of different churches and different. So this is, to me, a generative way of looking at it, where we are not all of one mindset, but we are all of one sort of focus. And I think that that is more generative to get the result that we want, versus trying to convince an institution to do this because. I think that they only go so far until they start seeing the world around them changing as well. And so when we start to get those changes and those growths and those outcroppings of different ways of doing things, then they start to wake up again.
So that's interesting. You think they being the institution will wake up again, whereas I would almost advocate it's going to die.
Yeah.
And something new will come.
Yeah. And I think it's the same. That's nuance. I think that death is required. I think that we, even in all sort of Christian settings, should understand that death is required in order to become something else.
Sure. But is it nuance? If
but
can we take it to United Church dies?
I think that if we sort of take that example of the resurrection, try to understand it in terms of there's a way and a belief and an understanding that is being challenged and in a way foretold. That beyond that, in the resurrection, in this new example, we are taking what worked and we're reflecting upon that history, that past. I don't think we do that a lot. I think we do a lot of let's just start something new and let's begin again, not really reflecting on those failures or the challenges that were successful.
Yeah.
I think that we need to build on that.
That's the opposite. Yeah. Thank you. This was really good. I hope that some of you pulled out some gems. We have a Q&A. Are you okay for a Q&A?
Sure. Yeah.
Any questions? That was Tony Snow joining us in 2019 at a house conversation series put on by Cypher Church. I left most of it intact because I wanted the listener to share in the lingering response that Tony provided for so many different questions there. A rich oral history of the Stoney people. That's our land, our space here in Calgary on Treaty 7. But there are stories on the land that you sit on as well, and I encourage you to go and seek them out. Reconciliation happens when we figure out what it means to dig deeper into profound and authentic relationships. I hope you pulled out a gem or two from this past interview, something that will propel you along the pathway of reimagining your faith and ultimately decolonizing your faith as well.